Hey guys, welcome back for another video on Azure Data Factory. My name is MitchellPearson, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at parameters and expressions to make your Azure Data Factory pipelines and data sets and data flows, to make those dynamic, to make them reusable, to improve your manageability. So let me kind of jump over. We're going to jump over to Management Studio real quick, kind of take a look at the data we're working with today and see exactly what we're trying to accomplish. So we're going to jump over here into Management Studio. And all I'm doing is I have an AdventureWorks database. It has some basic tables in it. And I want to take each of those tables individually and I want to create an extract of that table, right? I want to take all of the data that's in the table, dump that into a file over in my Azure Data Lake for whatever reason might exist. And so when I look at all of the different tables that we're going to be working with here, and I'm just going to grab all of these, that's a lot of different tables. And you might look at that and say, well, there's 12 different tables. That means in Azure Data Factory, I need to create 12 different pipelines. I need to create 12 data sets for the data source, right? One for sales customer, one for product model, one for product dimension. And then I need 12 data sets for the destination where we're loading those files into our Azure Data Lake. So one for customer list, one for product list, one for address list. But no, what we want to do here is leverage parameters and build out really a parent-child pipeline where the parent figures out what work needs to be done, and then we take that work and we pass it into the child pipeline. And that child pipeline, that worker pipeline, is reusable. Meaning that if I pass in customer, it connects to the customer table and creates a customer extract. If I pass in product, it connects to the product table and creates a product extract. Make sense? So that's what we're going to be doing here. That is our goal. That is our challenge. And so without further ado, what we're going to do is we can jump over to our Azure portal real quick. And in our Azure portal, we'll go over to Azure Data Factory and take a quick review of what we did in the last video. So in the last video, we talked about expressions, specifically in Azure Data Factory, and how to start this process of making our pipelines and data sets reusable, right? And so the pipeline that we built was in this right here called ADF expressions. And it's just a basic copy activity. So copy data activity, we're grabbing data from our source, which is a products table in AdventureWorks. So we're just grabbing data directly from the products table, and then we're dumping that into our product list. And you'll see how the names of these data sets are hard-coded because they're not reusable for other types of, this isn't reusable for the customer list or the address list because it's hard-coded here. And that's why it's named Azure for my Azure. It's in Azure Data Lake, so I'll put that abbreviation there. And then the name of the Azure Data Lake storage account is MitchellPearson. And then the file that we're creating in that storage account is product list. And in the source, we kind of see the same thing. Azure, it's a SQL connection. It's AWDW, AdventureWorks Data Warehouse. And then we're connecting to the products table. So no need to make the names dynamic because quite frankly, it's not a dynamic data set. But we are about to change that right now. So this copy data activity was grabbing data from the products table, dumping it into a blob storage account. And if you remember, we were actually making the file name slightly dynamic by putting an expression on the end, right? So what we were doing is saying every time we create an extract for the products from our product table, we want to put the date on the end. We want to append the date on the end. So we did some stuff here. As you see, we won't go through all the code here again. If you want to see the code, if you want to watch me in action, making those changes and writing that, go back to the previous video. It's a quick, short video, and that'll get you ramped up, and then jump back into this one here. All right, so that's what we did in that pipeline. So what we want to do in this video is we want to expand upon that. Instead of just taking one table and creating one extract, I want to grab all 12 of those tables we saw just a moment ago in Management Studio, and I want to create 12 extracts with the date appended to the end, making this very dynamic. Now, because I want to also show you parameters and passing parameters from a parent pipeline down to a child, we're also going to create an extra pipeline here that does the administrative work, the orchestration, figuring out what work needs to be done. This is extremely common in ETL processes where we maybe have some kind of task queue table, we have some kind of backlog table that tells us what work needs to be done. And so then we use a parent package to go figure out what work needs to be done, and then it executes the worker nodes. It executes the child nodes that will do that work. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. And I think we'll go ahead and start with our parent pipeline first. So I'm going to come over here under ADF expressions, really just in pipelines. And I'm going to create a new pipeline real quick right there. And then I'll give it a name so that I have it for future reference. And we'll call this 12 underscore and then parent. All right, so we have 12 underscore parent here. And then what we want to do inside of here is we want to go get the work that needs to be done. Now, we have that work over here in Management Studio. And I'm bringing this back by just running a very simple SQL query that gets me my schema and gets me my tables, and I put S's on the end to avoid any kind of reserved keywords or anything like that. And so I'm going to copy this code out right here, and we want to bring this information into Azure Data Factory. So back in Azure Data Factory, we're going to use the lookup activity. Now, I've done a video on the lookup activity in conjunction with the Foreach activity. I've done a video on this before. I've done a video on kind of how to reference the elements within the arrays. I've done all that. That's another video. I'll put that in the comments below as well. We'll go through this section a little bit quicker in this video, assuming that maybe you've seen those videos in the past. But once again, if you want to dive more into this, go take a look at those other videos that I've done previously. So I'm going to take a look at this lookup activity here. And inside of that, I'm going to go into my settings. And in the settings, I need to do a couple things. One, I need to point to a data set that's pointing to my Azure AdventureWorks data warehouse. So I'll go in here and I'll just grab something like, I got to find one of my Azure SQL connections. And it really doesn't matter which one I grab as long as it's pointing to the AWDW, right? So I'm going to grab this one right here that we used in our previous video. And you see that it brings back a schema of sales LT and a product table. This is going to be completely ignored because what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab and I'm going to put a query in here. So we're writing a query right here that's going to return the schema and the table from that database that's being referenced up here. So this is still pointing to the AdventureWorks database, but we're not going to return the data from the product table. What we're going to return is actually the list of schemas and tables from that database that we are currently referencing. All right, so that's going to return that. There's nothing else that I don't want to return the first row only. I want to return all rows of data. So we'll uncheck that. Glad I saw that. And then that's the first part here. Now what we can do, just to remind you if you've seen my other videos, is we can debug this. And this will actually run. And once it's complete, we can come down here and we can take a look at the output of the lookup activity. Now if you haven't seen my previous videos, this is really important because we need to be able to reference the elements within this JSON code, and we're going to be referencing that value because within that value, which is an array, it's in a list, right? This is an array, it's a list that has all of the items within that, which is all of our tables from our AdventureWorks database. We have our customer, we have our product model. And if I scroll down here, you'll see we have other things like product description, we have product model, product description, product category, then we have that DBO right there. So this is going to be pretty cool because in our data lake, we're going to grab all of this and we're going to create those the directory locations dynamically and the file names. Now, we have our data that we need. The next step here is we want to go and we want to add in a Foreach loop container that's going to loop over this array that I just showed you. So I'm going to, over here in our activities, grab iteration and conditionals, and we're going to bring in the Foreach activity, like so. We'll connect these guys up, and what I'm doing here, of course, is if the lookup runs successfully, then you run the Foreach loop. That's what this green line represents. Keep in mind that you can always do on failure, on completion, on skip. That right there, that's extra, no charge, that's free, all right? No charge for that. But that's pretty cool because you can change if it's on success, on failure. So for those of you coming from an SSIS background, you know this is how we start to control that orchestration a little bit better, and we control the flow of which activities execute and when, and if they execute at all. So that's just a little bit extra that maybe you didn't know about, but that's how you would do that here. So with that being done, we're going to say, look, this Foreach activity will execute when that's successfully done. So we go to the Foreach activity, and the first thing that we have to tell it is what is the Foreach activity going to be iterating over? What is the array? What is the object that it is going to be iterating over? So once again, this is something that I covered in one of my other YouTube videos, but essentially we're going to grab the items that the lookup activity created. So we'll go into our dynamic content here, and then over here on the right where it says activity outputs, we're going to let this write some of the code for us. So I'll click on that right there. This doesn't quite get everything for us though, unfortunately. So what we have to do is we have to come in here and tell it dot value. Remember that object, remember that array that had all of our tables inside of it. And I said we need that. This is where we complete this action. So this is going to now give the for each activity that array, that list of items that it can now loop over so that we can process those one by one by one. So that's going to be the goal there. Let's go ahead and click finish. And that's pretty good. So now we have our array that we want to loop over. Now we need to add some activities to the for each activity. And we can do that either by clicking the pencil icon here, or we can do that by clicking it right here. And so I'll go ahead and click right here. That takes us into, of course, kind of nested inside of the for each activity. And we want to perform some kind of activity. And the activity that we're going to perform, and we're going to come back to this, is we're going to execute a pipeline. So the parent is going to do what? This parent pipeline is going to get a list of all the tables that we want to create extracts of. And then the for each activity is going to loop over each one of those tables one by one. And we're going to pass that information into our worker pipeline, our child pipeline. So that's the goal. Now we haven't created the child pipeline yet. So we're going to take the one that we created in our last video. We'll make a copy of it. We'll make a clone of it so that we're not messing up that one. And then we're going to make some modifications and we're going to make some changes to that. So that's what we're going to do next. So we'll come back to this parent pipeline here in just a little bit. But first, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and create our child pipeline, and then we need to create our data sets. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to come over here and I'm going to click on the ellipsis. We're going to clone the data set that we created previously in our last video. So I'll clone that right there to create a duplicate of that. And then we'll give this a name, right? We're not going to leave this as create product extract copy. So over here, I'm just going to call this number 12, and then we'll call this child, or if you want, if you prefer, you can call it like your worker pipeline. All right. So that's going to be our child pipeline. And then we need to update this to where this is going to connect to a dynamic data set, and this is going to connect to a dynamic data set that we can pass parameters and expressions into. And so I'm actually going to go find those existing data sets that we used previously. I'm going to duplicate them, and we're going to make them 100% dynamic so that we can then start working with these parameters here, right? So the first one that we used in our last video is going to be this Azure SQL. We know this is our SQL connection because of that abbreviation right there. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to clone this right here. And then I'll go ahead and give this a name real quick. So this is going to be called Azure SQL, Azure Data Warehouse, and then we'll call this something like Dynamic Table, like so, because the table name is going to be dynamic. This data set will accept a schema and table name. Boom. All right. So that's pretty cool. Now, the other thing that's pretty cool about this that we need to talk about is that how do we make the data set 100%, essentially 100% dynamic? Well, we need to create parameters in the data set. Now, I think I might have done this in the last video because I think they're already here, but I'm going to delete them real quick and I'm going to add them back in so we can talk about these parameters and exactly what they are doing. So if I zoom in over here and I go into my parameters, I do have them already here, which I thought they were. But what we're going to do here is create a new parameter, and this is a parameter that is defined on this data set specifically, and we're going to call this one our schema parameter. And I could give it a value, or I can give it just some kind of fake value because we want to override this value, because when that parent pipeline executes, we want to pass through the schema and the table name, right? And we want to pass it into this data set so that it grabs the right table. And so we're going to add another schema or another parameter here. We'll call this one table. And this is going to be placeholder as well. So if we were to run this right now, this data set, it's going to connect to placeholder.placeholder, which doesn't exist, and it would fail. So that's why we put it there. So we know if it fails, whatever mapping we're doing with our parameters is not quite working correctly here. So we have that done. Now we're not done. We're going to go back over to connection. And this is still hard-coded here. Those parameters right now are doing nothing. They are completely benign. They're not doing anything. What we need to do is we need to tell it right here to not go to sales.lt.product, but to use the parameters that we're passing in. And the way we do that is we click Edit, and then we set up the schema and we set up the table to both use the parameters. So first we'll do the schema. We'll go in here, click on Add Dynamic Content, and then we're going to grab our schema parameter that we created. Make sure I'm not in the way there. So we'll grab that right there. and then we'll click Finish. And then we're going to do the same thing with product. We'll do Add Dynamic Content again, and we're going to grab our table. So now, anytime this data set gets executed, it's always going to try to bring data from placeholder.placeholder unless we pass in a value that overrides that placeholder and changes the schema to something like sales LT. And the table would be placeholder unless we replace that with something like product or customer or address. So this is now 100% dynamic. This is awesome. This is incredible. If I go over here and click on schema, this is pretty important for all of this working. You'll notice how the schema, we did not import the schema. And so what's happening here is we're not importing the schema because one of the things that Azure Data Factory does extremely well is what's called late arriving schema. We don't know what the schema is going to be necessarily. If you're from SSIS like I am and you worked with SSIS for many years, you know that in integration services, SQL Server integration services, you know that it was very metadata rigid. You had to define the schema up front, and if the schema changed, you'd have to go back in and update your data sets, update your packages, or they wouldn't even run, right? Data Factory is a lot different in that regard. It's much more flexible, it's much more dynamic. And so what happens here is we don't define the schema on this data set because we're going to let it be defined at runtime when the table is provided. So this is cool. In SSIS, we would have had to, for these 12 tables, we would have had to create 12 different data sets. And you kind of can manage that a little bit inside of each individual package, and it wouldn't be a global data set. But in Azure Data Factory, all of our data sets and all of our data flows that we create are global within that Azure Data Factory. And so we want to make them reusable so we don't have hundreds of unnecessary data sets making it overwhelming. And maybe you're watching this video today and you're like, I wish I would have known about this sooner, because you've been doing that. You were used to that old mindset. So let's go ahead and wrap up and finish up this video here. We're not going to import the schema. We now have a dynamic data set that's going to point to our AdventureWorks data warehouse and bring back the dynamic table. Now, we are going to go over here and create a copy of our connection to our Azure Data Lake, and we're pretty much going to do the same thing. So I'll clone that real quick, and let's give this a better name. It's going to be MitchellPearson, that is correct, but then the file name is going to be dynamic file, right? So it's going to be some dynamic file that we are creating here, and then we'll come back to this right here in a minute. We'll come back to the dynamic connection, but the first thing we want to do is go into parameters. And I think what I'm going to do under my parameters is we're going to have a file name, that's fine, but we also want to have a directory here. All right, so we're going to have a directory and a file name. So let me get rid of this. We'll replace that with placeholder and then placeholder. I personally like to put bogus kind of information in here so that if the parameters are not properly populated, it fails, and I see it fails, and I know there's a problem with my parameter mapping, right? If you put something in here like a legitimate directory and a legitimate file name, which unfortunately this will create a directory called placeholder, but if you do that and it works, then you don't know or realize it's not necessarily working correctly. So I like to do that. Once again, we are not going to define the schema here, so we can clear that out. We don't need the schema. And then we'll go over to our connection. And under our connection, this is where we can come in here and kind of update this. So first, the directory. So we're going to be loading this into my MitchellPearson storage account, into my container called YouTube. And then within that YouTube container, we're going to be creating a directory dynamically based on the schema. So if the schema is sales LT, we're going to put it into the sales LT folder. If it's DBO, we're going to put it into the DBO folder so it's easier to find. So once again, we go into dynamic content. We're going to grab the parameter from this data set specifically. That will be directory. And then that will finish up that. And then I'm going to come over here and just adjust this a little bit. And you'll see, I actually think in the last video, I kind of mentioned this briefly, and then I moved on and didn't talk about it very much. But I've already mapped this file name parameter from this data set. I've already mapped it to the expression here. So that's already done. So nothing to change here. And then we'll come out and we'll click Finish. Now, this is now 100% dynamic. So what have we done? Let's do a quick recap because there's a bunch of moving pieces in here. If you're watching this right now, you're like, wait a minute. There's a lot of clicking, a lot of moving around, a lot of navigation. What's going on? We started with Azure SQL Database, and we had that Azure AdventureWorks data warehouse that had 12 tables that we wanted to process. We went and created a parent pipeline. The parent pipeline is going to do a lookup to return all 12 tables that we want to do work on. We're going to pass that list of tables into the Foreach activity, and that is going to loop over and process each one of those files individually. So far, so good, right? Now, what does it do with those files when it's processing them? Well, it's going to grab the first table, product or customer or whatever it is, and we're going to get the schema, we're going to get the table name, and we're going to pass that into our worker pipeline. We're going to pass that into the child pipeline. So we'll pass that into the child pipeline, and it's going to then do some work. So what work does the child do? Well, it's going to take the data that's in our source, the table that we're connecting to, and it's going to extract all of that data, and it's going to make a copy of it into our data lake, into our blob storage account, general purpose account, whatever it is, wherever you want to take it. It's going to dump it there, and we're going to create a directory location if one does not already exist that's going to match the schema, and then we're going to create a file name that's dynamic, that has the file of the table that we are copying, but then it has the name of the table we're copying, and we're going to pin the date on the end with .csv. So let's wrap this up. Let's bring this whole thing full circle now and see what this looks like. So we have our copy data activity in our child or our worker pipeline that we're currently working on. We need to update this. So now that we've done all that work with our data sets, we now need to reference our data sets in this copy activity. So we're going to first point to, and then let me make sure I'm not blocking this. We're first going to point to our SQL dynamic table. All right. And then you see right here it says placeholder. Well, what are we going to pass into this, right? What are we going to pass into this to replace the schema and the table name? And this is where it could get a little bit tricky. So I'm going to click in the background of this pipeline right here. And when I click in the background, we get the properties for this pipeline. And you'll notice this pipeline does not have any parameters. So this is where we get to the parameter part of this. This pipeline does not have any parameters. And what I want to do is I want to pass in from the parent here, as I'm looping over the schema and I'm looping over the table name, I want to pass those in to this child or worker pipeline. So therefore, this pipeline right here that's going to be doing all the work, this is our worker, it needs to have the necessary parameters. So we're going to create a parameter here. This is going to be called schema, and that's going to bring in the schema from the parent that's calling it, and then we're going to pass in the table name. And I'm going to leave these blank. All right, I'm going to leave these blank. We're not going to give them any value whatsoever because that's going to be populated by the parent. Now, if I come back over to the parent, we now have a pipeline that we can execute. So let's go back into the Foreach activity. Once again, I know this is a lot of moving pieces. Trust me, I know. But in the execute pipeline, we're going to go into the settings and we're going to tell it what pipeline do we want to execute. And we are going to be looking for 12 child or worker, whatever you want to call it there. And then we're going to take, it says, look, we noticed that that pipeline you're executing has 2 existing parameters. And we know that to be true because we just created them. What value do you want to pass in from this pipeline to populate that schema and to populate that table? So we want to grab the current item that the Foreach iterator is looping over. So we go into dynamic content, we grab the current item like so, and then we are going to put a little curly bracket right here, go to the in, and I'm going to say go ahead and grab .schemas, and then I'm going to close that up. Now what this is doing right here when I say grab .schemas is remember that every item within that list that we created had a schema name and had a table name. When I created it back in Management Studio, if we were to go over to Management Studio, remember I aliased the names as schemas and tables with an S. So I didn't want to type all this out in Azure Data Factory, so I made it a little bit shorter, and then I added an S to the end to avoid any kind of keyword violation type stuff. And so that is what I'm referencing here, the item that I'm currently looping over, and then this is the property that I want to return the value from. So that'll be the schema, click Finish, and then down here, and this is one of the places where a lot of people struggle with Azure Data Factory is really this expression language, but this is where you do that. So then under table, I'll click right there. We're going to add dynamic content again. And then under here, what we'll do is we'll go in here and grab the current item. And then we want to do, this time we're going to do .table. So I'll add my curly bracket in there, .tables, close the curly bracket, and we'll click Finish. So now what it's doing is the parent is getting a list of all the work that needs to be done. The Foreach loop activity gets a list of all of those items, and it processes and executes this underlying pipeline one at a time. A couple of properties that are worth mentioning here. One, I have it set to wait on completion. If you don't turn this on and you don't wait on completion, then what happens? Well, if you don't wait on completion, then it's going to execute the child and it's going to report here that it ran successfully, or at least it executed it successfully, which is true. It did execute it successfully, but I would rather it wait for completion and return either a failure or a success. So that's the first thing. The other thing I want to mention here that's important is under the Foreach activity, there is a property in here as well, under settings, where you can set if you want this to be sequential or how many you want to run in parallel at a time. So you can control this. Keep in mind, I'm going to be running this in debug in Azure Data Factory. I'm not running this in production. So it's automatically going to run sequentially anyway. But if you needed to force this to be a sequential operation, which sometimes you do, you need only one to run at a time and you need them to run in a very specific order. I think I covered that also in that other video on the lookup and the Foreach activity. Then you would want to force this to be a sequential operation, not a parallel operation. Now, we've done all of the hard work and I think we might actually be done. Let me look back over this again. We're going to look it up. We're going to do this. We're going to go over here to our pipeline and we're going to pass the values in. Actually, there's one more thing we need to do. Down here, we created these parameters. So we're going to pass from the parent the values that we need into these parameters in our child or in our worker pipeline, right? So we're almost done. However, we need to now pass in the pipelines in this, or not the pipelines. We need to pass in the parameters from this pipeline, from the worker that just got received. We just received them from the parent. We need to take that parameter value and we need to pass it into our source and our destination data set that we created that's dynamic. Because remember, right now they both still have placeholder in there. So that's the last piece. That's the missing piece. So over here under schema, we're going to do what we've already done before and we're going to go ahead and map the schema and the table to some dynamic content. So we're going to grab dynamic content here and then we're going to grab the schema parameter from this pipeline, pipeline.parameters.schema. And we'll go ahead and finish. We'll do the same thing under table. We'll grab the table parameter, pipeline.parameters.table, and click finish. And the source is done. 100% dynamic. This is going to be awesome. Now we go over to the sync. And in the sync, we need to do, well, first of all, we need to update the sync because it's pointing to the wrong destination. So we want to grab our dynamic file that we created right here. You'll notice that the parameters change where they have placeholder in them. And we're going to replace that once again. The file name is going to be the name of the table. So we can just grab the table name. So if the table name was product, the file name we create is going to be product. And then of course, we're making that more dynamic with that expression language. Go back and watch the last video. So we're going to grab that and click finish. And then the directory that we create is going to be based on the schema. So if the schema is sales, we create a directory called sales. If the schema is production, we create a schema called production. And so we'll go over to our parameters again and we'll grab the schema and click finish. All right. So I am pretty sure that's everything. We're not going to do any mapping here. We don't want to map it because remember, we don't know what the columns are going to be in advance. This is a late arriving schema. And so the last thing that we need to do here is we need to go ahead and execute this pipeline. So we can go back over to the parent. I'm going to click on debug here and we're going to let this run. Now, you'll notice we get a warning message up here in the top right that simply says, look, you are executing this in debug mode. And so because of that, everything's going to be executed sequentially. That means one after the other, it's going to be executed sequentially. Therefore, it's not going to really perform great. If you want to do a performance test on this, you need to publish this out to Azure Data Factory, run this from a trigger, manually execute it, and then see what that performance is going to be. So let me close out of here. And then hopefully, a lot of moving pieces here. So we're going to hope that we did not get an error message. We're going to refresh it. Yes, it's running successfully. I always love that. It always feels great. So now let's go back over to our storage account right here. You'll notice I have 2 containers in my MitchellPearson storage account, and I'm in the YouTube container. I'm going to refresh it. And now we have a new folder for the DBO schema, and we have a new folder for the sales LT. And if we go in there, we have customer list, product category list, product description, product list. We don't have product yet, so we're still missing, nope, product's there too. So we're missing a couple of them. And you'll notice that if I refresh it again, it'll come back. So we get the name, we appended the word list in there, if you remember that expression from the previous video, and then we have the date. We refresh it again, And this is beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. So we append the date on the end. We got rid of the timestamp. All of that was done in our previous video. I know this was a lengthier video compared to the ones that I normally do. My videos are usually pretty short, but some topics require a little bit more explanation and a little deeper dive. Now, a lot of what I covered in this video, I hope you liked the video. I hope you understood it. If you didn't, go through it again. A lot of what I covered in this video, I went through a little bit quicker than I normally do because I have covered this content in other YouTube videos. So in the description below, in the comments below, I'm going to put a couple of links that link to some of my other YouTube videos that I've done. Once again, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe. I should have said that at the beginning. I always forget. Enjoy. I'll see you next time.